The gacha community has been at war recently, arguing about power creep in Honkai Star Rail. And you know what, your boy actually even had a brief opportunity to kind of give some of my piece and take part in it, but I gotta admit something, it wasn't as great as it could have been. And I want to do a little bit of a retrospective as to why that is, where things have gone to, and what I think this means overall for the community, how we talk about things moving forward. So let's give a little bit of context for those of you who might be a little bit confused. A lot of this originally spurred off because Mr. Pokey had made some takes on Twitter about power creep, saying that Honkai Star Rail does not have a power creep problem, but that players have a greed and stupidity problem. This spurred into a bunch of Twitter discourse, people arguing with Mr. Pokey about his take, him defending his take, and a lot of just really going back and forth online, which then spurred on an opportunity for a conversation. I was then invited by my friend Captain Cabinets along with Ethan and another content creator, VXV Fiction, to sit down and have a conversation with Mr. Pokey where we were going to go to war and we were going to, argue our takes about what was going on. And I must say, it was a bit of a mess, okay? We went in there, I think there was a lot of core issues with how it was structured, and I'm not throwing blame at anyone there, but I think that was the reason why it wasn't as effective as it could have been, because I came in with a different set of argumentation and the point that I was trying to prove, where Ethan was arguing something different from me, and Cap and VXV were also arguing different things. Like, for example, V was arguing more so around, the choice of language that Mr. Pokey used with calling someone stupid or greedy and that just being antagonistic. I was arguing more from like a functional standpoint in that power creeping the 1.0 characters is just cut and dry, feels bad, and it's kind of changed the expectation of the players. You get the idea. We were all arguing different things. What this then allowed for over the course of this conversation is we could never really nail anything down. Anytime one of us would kind of go down a line of argumentation with Mr. Pokey, for example, me trying to bring up like him making the argument that Memory of Chaos clears are becoming so much easier because there's more variety of characters, and so there's more opportunity to make the clears and you have more tools in your tool belt to make that happen. I then countered his argument by talking more so about, well, let's look at the clear statistics, and it was all the newer meta characters anyway. But then as soon as I got down to that point, we derailed and flipped to another line of argumentation. We weren't able to actually land and come to any conclusions on anything over the course of that process. And of course, as a result, the feedback from the community was a little bit mixed in that we just went in circle for 3.5 hours. And while I definitely had fun doing it, I know a lot of people didn't feel like we accomplished much. So I think there's something to be learned there, that if you are going to have a conversation like this, it needs to be a little bit better structured. You need to have more of a focus. Instead of it being 4v1, it felt more like 4 1v1s all happening at the same time, if that makes sense, which just didn't prove to be very effective. So as a result, Tectone then had a conversation with Mr. Pokey. He called the video, I had to punish him, things got serious, and where the two of them sit down and have a conversation around power creep. This conversation, honestly, I thought was fine. The reason being, I think Tectone had a clear objective here for what he was trying to talk about with Mr. Pokey. He managed to talk about that idea and then move on. So for example, a lot of people wanted him to be going much harder onto Mr. Pokey. They wanted him to tear him apart for his disconnected take. That's not what Tectone set out to do. He wasn't in there trying to do that. He was in there just to make sure that we understood that the blame is not to be put on the players. And look, credit where credit is due. They definitely did come to the conclusion, and I think agreement between the two parties, that while power creep is very much Hoyoverse's fault and is instigated and implemented by Hoyoverse, players can then mitigate power creep by pulling responsibly and pulling for the characters that are going to be most effective for their account. That's kind of where the conversation ended. And a lot of people were feeling kind of upset that they didn't go further into, okay, now that we've established that, we can now talk more about why power creep is having issues in Honkai Star Rail, but instead that's where the conversation ended. This led to some other instigation from the community, calling out Tectone, saying that he's going too soft on Mr. Pokey, and saying a lot of, I would say, like pretty rude crap to him pretty directly. This also then resulted in him dropping another video where he dropped the video, I'm disappointed, which is him kind of addressing his community, those in his community, for saying that he's not being more antagonistic antagonistic or going hard enough on Mr. Pokey. I think it's being a little unreasonable by the community to expect that of him. Because let's be real here for a second. If you're in an argument with your friend, especially on a public platform like this, and there's no real animosity between the two of you, no one's being an outright a-hole to each other or anything like that, like, you're not going to go out of your way to torch your friend if it's undeserving for them to be torched. And like, so I don't blame anybody, or I don't blame Tectone for not going harder on Mr. Pokey. Like, I think it was 100% completely reasonable, the approach that he was trying to take to that situation. However, prior to that video, he did release another video, which was a VOD of there was a disagreement, and this was finally an opportunity for Saint Tontes and Mr. Pokey to get in a call together, kind of semi-moderated by Tectone, where they were able to address power creep. Now, straight up and biased here. Saint Tontes is a friend of mine. He's a great dude. And also, they finally went into the freaking argumentation that I wanted to go down the whole time. When we did that 1v4 call, I was really, really wanting to go in on the meta structure and really show why the 1.0 units have been crept to the point that they're basically irrelevant entirely, and why that's a problem for the game and it's changed player expectation and why it's an issue. But I didn't get the chance to go down that line of argumentation. So the fact that that's the route that Saint went down, and Saint was really trying to focus in on this point, I gotta just admit, it made me feel really good. It made me feel really vindicated in that moment, but it was really good. And look, I listened to this whole conversation between the three of them, and I overall think it was a fairly productive conversation, and Saint Tontes did a great job in not allowing kind of the goalposts to be moved when you're talking about power creep. We're gonna do a little bit of an educational moment here. When you're debating with somebody or you're arguing with somebody, you need to make sure you don't allow them to move the goalpost in the middle of an argument. Let me give you an example. If Saint Tontes over the course of the argument was able to show, hey, 1.0 characters are basically irrelevant to the game unless you pull the meta 2.0 characters, and you're able to focus in, he stays on that line of argumentation, and he's able to basically corner Mr. Pokey on that point. Mr. Pokey then attempts to shift the course of the conversation to say, well, it's not really relevant because if a player isn't pulling on meta characters anyway and only pull what they like, well, then they don't care about clearing the 3 stars or getting those 80 stellar jades. But the thing is, did you see what happened there? That was never the argument. The argument was never, players care about that. The argument is, those 1.0 characters are basically irrelevant without the meta 2.0 characters. That's moving the goalpost. That's when you allow someone to walk away from a point that they've lost and in hopes of finding another point that they can actually get the win on, and you therefore trick the listener into thinking, well, then they won the first point as well. If you want to be an effective arguer, and this is something that I'm striving to be better at and to doing and to having those kinds of conversations, you can't allow somebody to make that flip. And I think that was kind of like a masterclass of this argumentation. And in this VOD, if you do get a chance to go back and listen to it, that Saint does a great job in not allowing Mr. Pokey to do that. And let me be clear here as well, caveats, I love my caveats here. I have no ill will against Mr. Pokey. I had a lot of fun in my conversation. None of this is me trying to go in on Mr. Pokey in this moment. I'm just trying to look back at what has kind of happened over the course of these conversations. And it started off with kind of messy, unregulated, going in circles. Guilty. I was part of that. Guilty. Into other conversations that I don't think we're setting out to accomplish what listeners were expecting or viewers were expecting, and people criticizing Tectone and Gotchasmack for going too soft on Mr. Pokey. And I don't think they went too soft. I just think they had different objectives than the viewer. And then into a more concrete course of argumentation here with Saint in leading to, I think personally, a pretty much cut and dry argument of that there are power creep issues in Honkai Star Rail. Like, I think it's pretty much just set at this point. Now, I don't think this now means we need to have like a Mr. Pokey crash out arc or anything here. I'm not looking for anything like that. But I think what we can do now is think about it from this perspective. You as the listener, you as the viewer. Make sure you're always setting your expectations for these conversations or dialogues appropriately. I don't think it's fair, the attack that Tectone has been getting for going too soft on Mr. Pokey, because look, I don't think you need to be overly antagonistic and rude and try to tear down your friends. No, you don't need to do that. So I think it's unreasonable the amount of hate that he's been getting on that. But we can still learn from this moment. We can still learn from our dialogues, become better conversationalists, debaters, I said conversationalists, but clearly I still have learning that I need to do as well. But this is what I'm just trying to take from it, to be better in the future, to have better conversations in the future as a, content creator for you guys and for others in the space as well. But I hope you learned something in this video. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of a recap of everything that's been going on. I've been enjoying my little part of it, but that's going to be all for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.